Welcome to today's webinar, Intellectual Freedom for All, Safeguard Against Censorship of GLBT Books. June is GLBT Book Month, a time when we recognize the authors and writers that reflect the lives and experiences of the GLBT community. It is clear from the horrible tragedy in Orlando that we need these stories and perspectives, now more than ever. 4 of the top 10 most challenged books in 2015 had GLBT content. I Am Jazz by Jessica Herthel and Jazz Jennings. Beyond Magenta, Transgender Teens Speak Out by Susan Cornermen. Fun Home by Alison Bechdel. Two Boys Kissing by David Leviathan. The American Library Association advocates for a diverse collection in libraries, and the GLBT Roundtable helps support that with the Stonewall Awards and their new toolkit, Open to All. I am honored to have Stonewall author Gayle Pitman with us today. By day, Gayle teaches psychology. Let me over here. And coordinates the Women Gender Studies program at Sacramento City College. She developed and currently teaches a course on the psychology of sexual orientation and gender identity, which is the only class of its kind to be offered within the California community college system. She views education as a platform for social justice and brings a strong value of equity and intersectionality to all aspects of the educational system. By night, Gayle writes children's books and engages in other forms of subversive creativity. Her debut picture book, This Day in June, won the 2015 ALA Stonewall Award, was a Rainbow List Top 10 pick, and won the IRA's 2014 Notable Books for a Global Society Award. And with her, we have Peter Coyl. Peter is District Manager of the Dallas Public Library's J. Eric Johnsel Central Library. That's a mouthful. He has worked in public libraries for over 15 years and has served on a library board and been a school librarian. Peter is currently chair of ALA's Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, and Transgender Roundtable and serves on the Texas Library Association Intellectual Freedom Committee. He served as chair of the Stonewall Book Award Committee in 2013. He earned his MLS degree with a concentration in youth services from Drexel University and was named to their 40 Under 40 list in 2016. And last but certainly not least, Suzan Cornermen is a dear friend of mine. She works as an interior designer and a mother of 2 in Wisconsin. Her youngest is a transgender boy. For 50 years, she has been a public library user and vocal supporter of its role in the community. Most of her life experiences focus on advocacy for children and human rights. And I am your host, Kristen Pekoe, and I am the Assistant Director at ALA's Office for Intellectual Freedom. And now I will turn the presentation over to Dr. Gayle Pitman in California.
Good morning, or good afternoon to some of you on the East Coast. Can everybody hear me okay? I'm going to assume so. So I'm so honored to be a part of this webinar, partly because I have so much respect for all of the work that you do. And I think that I have gotten even more respect as a result of the efforts to ban my first children's picture book, This Day in June, which I'm going to spend some time talking about that process. I'll talk about some of the positive impacts that my book has had, and I'll also talk about the book banning effort in Hood County, Texas. And I just want to start by saying that when I wrote this book, even before it got published, I really wanted it to tell the truth. I mean, I wanted it to be an honest, realistic, but also kid-friendly and developmentally appropriate depiction of a pride celebration. So I didn't want it to be watered down. I didn't want it to be sugar-coated. I didn't want elements to be excluded. I wanted it to be realistic, but also fun and whimsical and, you know, just like what you would experience going to Pride. And so when Imagination Press picked it up, I was a little bit nervous because, you know, once a book goes into the hands of an editor and once it is slated for publication, you just never know what's going to happen to it. It kind of takes on a life of its own. And luckily, my editor, Christine Enderle at Imagination Press, had a similar vision to me. She wanted it to be fun, she wanted it to be exciting, and she wanted it to be real and honest. And if anything, she wanted to, queer it up more than I had even thought to. So anytime when I had first seen the initial sketches and initial dummies for the book, the galleys for the book, I was so heartened to see Christine saying, you know, pump it up, you know, make it more gay, put more rainbows in there. It's okay to have men kissing. It's okay to have women kissing. And so I just wanted to share a few of the page spreads. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the book, but I'm imagining that some of you have probably read it, others have not. But I wanted to share some of the page spreads just so you could see how we achieved that goal or tried to achieve that goal. So basically the story is really simple. It's geared towards very young children. It's told in rhyming couplets, and you can see two of the rhyming couplets here where it says motors roaring, spirits soaring. This is very early on in the book where it depicts the dykes on bikes. And any of you who have been to Pride, I'm sure, is very familiar with the dykes on bikes. It really is this exciting start to the parade when the motors start revving up and you hear the crowd cheering, and there's just this real, for me, there's this real rise of excitement that happens. And so that's the dykes on bikes. There's a page later that depicts a float with, you know, kind of a marine theme to it. You have the sailors, you have beach balls, you have mermaids, and people just dressed up in costume. And you can also probably see the way that Christina Litton, the illustrator for the book, designed each of the two-page spreads. They're all these little spots of color that are throughout, almost like confetti or glitter, again, to really exude that, that party scene. This is a spread that my daughter, who's now 8 years old, she was almost 6 when the book was published. She calls it the pink page. And it's so funny because when it first came out and we were going through this for the first time, she looked right in the middle. She zeroed in on that brown-haired girl with the glasses and said, "Mommy, that's you." And oh my gosh, that just warmed my heart. So I just share some of these spreads just to familiarize you with the book. And to say that overwhelmingly, the response to it has been positive. I can't tell you how many people have either come up to me in person or emailed me or tweeted me or called me to tell me that the book made them cry. And these are adults that I'm talking about, adults who didn't have a book like this when they were younger, that didn't have depictions of any type of positive representation of LGBT identity. And so to see people with rainbows, to see people, 2 men or 2 women kissing, to see people who are gender nonconforming, to see people of color on the pages of the book, to see people in leather. When I was at the ALA convention last year signing books after the Stonewall Award ceremony, there was a man that came up who was literally in tears, who said, "Thank you so much for putting images of leather in the book, because that's my community and it means so much to me. It's how I really felt plugged into my identity, and to see that represented in a book, a children's book, just was so overwhelming to him." So that's the positive side. Now let me switch to the other side. Oh, and before I do that, I just had to put a little plug for GLBT Book Month. I imagine that some of you have seen these posters and bookmarks. And when I found out last year that the GLBT Book Month advertising materials were going to feature illustrations from this day in June, I just was so excited, because it really does tie into my value of books and education being a form of social justice, that it's not just about a book, you know, publishing a book and getting it out there in the world. It's about the change that it can potentially affect, and getting anybody to pick up a book and read it and fall in love with reading is an amazing goal. And on top of that, if people who are reading the books can see themselves represented or learn about communities that they're not a part of, that to me is a huge success. So it was right around the time that the Stonewall Award ceremony that last year at ALA was happening that I found out about the efforts to ban this day in June at a library in Hood County, Texas. And I found out about it in a very indirect, circuitous way. I had gotten a Twitter message from someone who was a patron at that library, and it essentially said, hey, I don't know if you know what's going on, but there's a bunch of people that are trying to ban your book. And I will admit that the very first thought that went through my mind was a comment that Sherman Alexie had made when his book, The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian, had been banned, or there had been attempts at banning it. His response on Twitter was ka-ching. And so there's been some truth in that. It's amazing how when you ban a book, it becomes more attractive. But I started digging a little bit more deeply, and what I discovered was that there were, in fact, attempts to ban this book. There was a woman who was a patron at the Hood County Library who was the wife of a local legislator, state legislator, and she claimed that she had brought her young daughter to the library, and her young daughter had picked the book off of a display and asked her mother, you know, what is this? You know, why are there men kissing each other? Or why are there women kissing each other? And that her mother, who is very religious, very conservative, I would say, card-carrying member of the Tea Party, very active in those political efforts, was horrified. And that began her efforts to try to ban the book. Now, just a little aside, this is maybe splitting hairs a little bit. After speaking with the librarian afterwards, throughout this process, who I've become to befriend, Courtney Kincaid, who is an amazing librarian. I'm sure many of you have heard of her efforts, and she won the I Love My Librarian Award, sponsored by the New York Times. She had told me that, yes, the book was on display. However, there was no way that the child could have plucked it off the shelf because it was out of a child's reach. It was up high on a shelf. So there was a little bit of, I would say, fabrication in the story. Nevertheless, it doesn't really matter because the efforts to try to ban the book were off and running. And there were really two efforts that were taking place. One was to ban the book outright. The other was to shelve the book, not in the children's section, but in the adult nonfiction section, which many people, including, I would say, members of the National Coalition Against Censorship, would argue is a form of censorship, because essentially what you're doing is trying to hide the book or trying to restrict the book from its readership, rather than creating as much access as possible. So I began to follow these efforts, and what I found was that, number one, these people were not going to play nice. I mean, they were really going to go all in for the fight to try to ban this book. And by the way, this day in June was part of a larger effort to ban not only that book, but another book that some of you might be familiar with called My Princess Boy, which came out a number of years ago. So those were the two that were their focus. And they, like I said, just didn't play nice. And I didn't experience very much directed towards me. I would say that most of the efforts and the anger and the negativity were directed towards Courtney Kincaid, and it's still ongoing, and she's still experiencing repercussions from it. And it's just awful, which it really tells me that it's beyond the scope of one or two particular books. This is a much larger effort that they're trying to engage in. So just a couple of examples of ways that they don't play nice. You can go on Twitter and find tweets very much like this. This is actually pretty tame in comparison to some of the tweets that I've seen. This tweet coming out around the time that a series of hearings were taking place that says, libraries' repulsive LGBT children's books, including My Princess Boy, alarm Texas community. Now, I have to say that at the time, obviously, these tweets were very upsetting to me, and to call to put the term LGBT and repulsive in the same phrase, even having those words next to each other, is heart-wrenching. Now, almost a year later, after the tragedy in Orlando, this breaks my heart. I mean, it really, I've honestly, I'm sure all of you have been following those news stories about Orlando, and it took me a day or two before I could even start talking about it. And it still feels like, you know, shell shock. I mean, it just feels very surreal that something like that even happened. It's just, it makes me angry, and it's terrifying. And the thought of being in a club and having someone come in and, you know, open fire is just in a place that is supposed to be community. It's supposed to be safe. It's supposed to be family, and it's supposed to be fun. And, you know, to completely decimate that is just a terrifying thought. And so now, almost a year later, I read this with a much, much heavier heart. It shows the level of anger and hatred and vitriol that are coming from people that are attempting to ban these books. And it's clearly out of fear. I mean, there's no doubt about it. They didn't stop with Twitter. So this is an image of a flyer that came to my attention through one of the patrons at the Hood County Library. Apparently someone had made a whole bunch of copies of this flyer and put them, they were going to shopping centers and Walmart and other places and putting them on people's windshields. And again, you can see the level of anger and hatred. And what really got me about this, and maybe this is just kind of a personal thing, is that it's clear that intellectual freedom and, you know, our First Amendment rights are just completely being exploited here. I mean, yes, they have the right to hold an opinion. They have the right to share that opinion. What really gets me is that they take information and twist it to their own purposes. And so you'll see in the middle here where they show a quote that I supposedly made that says, the more LGBT gay pride celebrations I go to, the more kids I see. A lot of kids programming starts at gay pride parades. I did not say that, at least not in that particular way. I have dug everywhere through every quote that I've ever made public and has gotten published on the internet. And the way that that quote is phrased is misleading. Now, having said that, I'm down with programming, if you're going to use that word, kids in a way that helps them with acceptance and respect and inclusivity. So if you want to use that word, that's fine. But it's just interesting and, again, scary to see the lengths that people go to. I mean, people got together and spent money and printed this up and took the time to actually flyer people's windshields over a book. I mean, that's the power of books, which is just unbelievable to me. So a campaign ensued as a result of that to write letters to the Hood County commissioners, who essentially were the body that was going to determine whether or not the book should stay on the shelves or not, and if it did stay on the shelves, where it would stay. And so a number of patrons of the Hood County Library had leveraged social media, trying to galvanize action, get as many people to write letters as they possibly could. I just had to share this because this is the letter that my daughter wrote. Again, she was 6 years old at the time, and she understood the power of books. And when I told her that there was a library, a group of people at a particular library that was trying to ban this book, she asked me what it means to ban a book, and I said it means that they want to keep it out of the library, they want to keep people from reading it. And she's 6 years old at the time, and the look of horror on her face just was really powerful. I mean, she got it. She got, this is a really powerful act, and it's not okay. It completely violates our First Amendment rights and completely violates intellectual freedom. And so we sent this letter. She wrote this herself. I thought it was very sweet. I thought it was cute that she took the time to actually make the letters rainbow one by one. And then she and I together actually wrote a stack of letters and hosted a letter writing party with some of our friends and colleagues and whatnot, and sent a whole batch of letters over. And they got many, many letters very much in support of keeping not just this book, but books like this with LGBT content on the shelves. And so ultimately what ended up happening was that the commission ruled in our favor. They essentially ruled to keep the book on the shelves. Now the fight isn't over. So the people who were against and still are against LGBT books in Hood County are extremely vocal, extremely politically active. They seem pretty knowledgeable about the law for the most part. And they're definitely on a crusade. And I heard I'd gotten a message from, again, another patron from Hood County who sent me a link to a local radio show where the woman who had initiated this campaign, Melanie Graft, who was the wife of the state legislator, sent me a link to a local radio show where she was talking about the book banning efforts. And what was really terrifying about this was that the radio hosts were, of course, egging her on and very supportive of the book banning efforts. But more broadly speaking, we're talking about how sinful homosexuality is and actually invoking violence. And Kristen is, actually this is really good timing. She's saying if we have time, I'm hoping to share some of the videos. So yeah, Kristen, why don't, if you have that, why don't we do that? Because I think it's really powerful, if you have it available.
I do, I have it right now. So keep talking while I pull it up.
Okay, perfect, that sounds great. You are so on the ball. And so I didn't watch the whole thing because it was long, at least if it's the video that I'm thinking that Kristen's about to pull up. But I watched the portion that had to do with this day in June and the book banning efforts and about LGBT people in general. And I have to tell you, I've heard a lot and I've seen a lot, and this sent chills up and down my spine because they truly feel like violence is an acceptable response to the LGBT community. And again, in the wake of the events in Orlando, it strikes too close to home. So.
All right.
It looks like we have it.
So we were experimenting a lot with the video, so please tell me if you can't get the audio. This is an 18-minute clip with Melanie. The whole video is well over an hour and a half, and it is available online. I don't feel like passing out the link. I don't want to give them any more views than I have to. But she talked a little bit about how her daughter found the book.
I've spoken to Parker County conservatives. I'm grateful for the opportunity you've given me today. I've spoken to the Northeast Tarrant County Tea Party.
Actually, forgive me, I'm going to go back a little bit here. To
open up to a page that had two men kissing and immediately asked me about it. And
That's wrong.
Yeah. I was left to explain to a 4-year-old homosexuality long before we ever talked about the birds and the bees.
My goodness, and this is in a public library. Now they had it on a high shelf. How did your daughter get at this?
I was holding her on my hip. So I was actually holding her. I was looking at some other books and she just picked it up. At first glance, it's hard to tell what it is until you open the book. It was just brightly colored. She picked it up, turned to the page, and showed it to me, and I was appalled at what was inside.
This happened in Texas, did it?
Yes, sir. Hood County, Granbury, Texas, which is a seemingly largely Republican, very conservative town, or so we thought.
Apparently the librarian isn't.
No, no, not at all.
Well, I mean, this is the equivalent of putting poison in Halloween candy, in my opinion. I mean, you know, to have something that I guess the cover was colorful enough to attract your daughter's attention?
Yes, sir, yes. And the inside of the book, it was worse. There were political issues, signs like love over hate, equal rights, things that a child certainly can't understand. And this book on the back binding was recommended for children ages 4 to 8.
A book teaching homosexuality in a children's book that's rated for ages 4 to 8? Are you kidding me?
Yes, and it's put out by the American Psychological Association.
The American Psychological Association has lost their collective minds, that is, if they ever had one, because this is ridiculous. This is destroying our children.
It is.
I think that's the intention.
Yep, they definitely have an agenda and an indoctrination for our children. Upon further research, we started with 3 LGBT children's books in our library.
We just call them BLTs here because they keep changing the acronym. So
that's easier. We'll go
BLTs,
with that.
yes.
We'll go with that. We started with 3, and we progressed to 11. We currently have 64 BLT children's books in our library that target children reading level grade 6 and lower. 54.
Now, how many Bible books do they have for children in that age range, do you suppose?
I haven't researched that as thorough, but I'm willing to bet we have more BLT.
I'm willing to bet that there are virtually none.
Well, we have a few, but not nearly.
Not nearly as many as the BLTs have in there.
Right.
Here's the problem with homosexuality, guys. And if you want to know why we don't have dinosaurs today, it's because they all became...
All right, I'm skipping the dinosaur part.
The local media in Hood County never came to get my side of the story and quickly accused us of book burning, book censoring, but it was always about parental rights and age appropriateness. I didn't have the right to decide what my daughter was going to see.
Well, if you're going to put something like that out and you're going to have it, you got to be at least 18 before you can check this book out, I would really have less of a problem with it.
Same here. I agree.
But giving this to a child who is 4 years old, that is wrong. It's immoral, and people that would do that should be harshly punished.
No.
I'm not going to say beaten or killed, but harshly punished.
That's another very...
Do I need to say it?
Okay.
That's another great point you bring up. The librarian that did this and ran to the media, she was actually flown out to New York and was awarded by the ALA, which is the American Library Association, extremely liberal, and $5,000 reward for what she's done. And she now works in the North Richland Hills as an assistant library there.
Sounds like New York values to me.
That's right in the middle of Fort Worth, North Richland Hills. It's a very nice section of Fort Worth.
Yes, sir.
This is highly offensive to me because this is wrong. This is immoral, and it's an absolute attack on our children.
It's not enough to tolerate. They want us to participate, and they want our children.
Well, it looks to me like they're doing a pretty good job of getting them because there's no way that you want a child under 18 even discussing something like this.
No, absolutely. I would have been just as opposed to this book had it been about heterosexual sex as well. It's not appropriate.
Well, that's it. I mean, the heterosexual sex probably should be discussed sometime around the age of 11 or 12, but not at the age of 4.
No, absolutely not.
I'm appalled. I'm apoplectic about this.
I think we have some serious problems here in Texas.
Well, Melanie, what are you doing about it, and how's it working out for you?
Okay, I just want to pause it there. There's more and what scares me most is the amount of casual mention of violence. Obviously, with what happened in Orlando, this is very significant that at one point he says, I just hope that when I go, I take them out with me. So there's a lot of violence here. It's just this. I wanted to show this because it's important to know what mentality, what other people, what mentality they're representing. So I want to definitely bring the floor back to Gayle and have her discuss it. She is more of an expert in it than I am.
Yeah, I mean, I am almost ready to wrap up because I know that we have 2 other speakers and I'm anxious to hear from them too. It's one thing to know intellectually that there are people out there who are definitely, crusaders for their cause and very homophobic, very transphobic, hate-filled, quite frankly, and are willing to resort to any type of action, even if it includes violence, in order to support their cause. And what's terrifying is that not only is this, they seem ready to, again, given the fact that we're all trying to grieve and understand and wrap our heads around what happened in Orlando, the reality is that it puts to the front, it puts front and center how, what's the word that I'm thinking of? How shaky our rights are, that we fought so hard to get where we are. And there are people who are at the ready that are prepared to take them away by any means necessary, even if it means resorting to violence. And not only are they willing to resort to violence, they oftentimes will invoke what they consider to be the Word of God, to invoke the Bible or some other type of religious text. And I think that what's also quite scary to me, I mean, you may have noticed in the background that this was, they were in a political setting and there were Trump signs in the back. And I have to think that with his racist and anti-immigration rhetoric, and just hate-filled rhetoric, that these attitudes, it gives permission for these attitudes to come forward. I think what often happens is that these attitudes lie within people, but they're sort of stealth until something happens to bring them forward. And I think that the book banning effort in Hood County was a really good example of that. Those attitudes were there all along. This was just an opportunity for people to express them, and also to find a group of people that supported them, which gives them much more power and gives them more leverage and amplifies their voices. It's one thing if it's one person who's thinking what they're thinking or holding certain attitudes, but if you have a group of people, especially if it's a group of people that have power, and I think it's no accident that Melanie Graff is politically involved, that her husband is a legislator, and she knows how the system works, and so she has kind of a platform for her voice to be heard more loudly, and there's more of an opportunity for people to jump onto that platform. So I hate to end this on a negative note. I mean, that's about as negative as it gets. I will say that I'm actually surprised that there haven't been more efforts than this to try to ban the book, because I knew that with honesty comes risk. But I was willing to take that risk because I wanted, I just think it's so important, especially being someone growing up not seeing any positive images of LGBT community at all. And really not seeing images of much diversity, period. I mean, just not recalling many images of people of color or people from different class backgrounds or, a range of different marginalized identities. And so it just is so important to me to be able to share those types of images and stories in an honest and realistic way that mirror the experiences of kids and adults that are part of those communities, because kids need to see themselves, and quite frankly, as a historically marginalized group, LGBT adults, I think really can use kids' books as a healing tool. There's something very, very powerful about reading a children's book that is positive and non-apologetic and completely embracing of who we are, that heals a part of ourselves. And I think as a community, we need that, and we need more of that. So yeah, I guess I'll wrap up there. And I know that Peter and Susan have very powerful things to say too.
Peter, are you there and available to jump in with your microphone?
Yes, I'm having issues with my mouse. There we go. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, all right. So I am very glad to be here today. I am going to talk a little about why materials are challenged and what we can do to prevent that. And I think I'll just say that materials are challenged for a variety of reasons. Lots of times I think it's personal feeling and preference. Parents don't want their children to be exposed to that material, or they're upset that their child has found out about something on their own timeline and not when the parent thinks they're ready. And I think a lot of parents have very deep-seated and good reasons. They want to be a parent, and I think they're trying to do the job the best they can. Unfortunately, it's not appropriate, I think, for one parent to decide what every child learns or reads. And that's oftentimes what happens in these cases. It's a parent or a group of people trying to put their their feelings or how they want their child to be raised on other people. And we have lots of different types of families that come to the library, and it's up to those families to make those decisions. And I think that's why it's important that we have processes in place to help prevent this from happening. Now, this slide says, how do we prevent challenges? That's a little bit of a misnomer. You can't prevent a challenge. I think that there will always be challenges. I think that parents will always have a concern. But I think that we can have ways to help us deal with those challenges and navigate the turbulence that happens with them. I think every library should have a toolkit, and those toolkit should contain your collection development policy and a procedure for reconsideration of materials. Both of these should be examined regularly. They should be adopted by the Board of Trustees or whatever group is in charge. And I think there are some components that are important for them. I'm going to talk a little bit about those. The first in the collection development policy, I think it should include a section adopting ALA policies and statements, which I'll explain a little bit later. It needs to have an outline of the type of materials purchased by the library. If you're not going to purchase ebooks, it needs to say that. If you're not going to purchase materials published, self-published, you need to say that as well. But it also has to talk about the discussion of how you select and purchase. Do you require the book to have a review in a certain trade journal? Do you have a certain vendor that you can only purchase things from? And I think this is a good practice to have. Most libraries have one of these, I think, but if you don't, I think it's important to look at these and develop them. Some are very long. Ours here at Dallas Public Library, it's about a 10-page policy. It doesn't have to be that long. I think it depends on how your library has decided to write it. It should explain how you add gift and donated materials. If you need to be able to say that you have the right to accept or reject a gift. You should talk about how you deselect and weed. If you get rid of a book, why do you get rid of it? Is it clearly defined? And it should refer to the reconsideration policy as a policy to follow if there are challenges, so that you can refer back to the other document when people have questions about a book being weeded or deselected or why you haven't added a gift. The relevant ALA policy statements I think that should be listed are the Library Bill of Rights and their interpretations that ALA has adopted. There's the Freedom to Read statement, there's the Freedom to View statement, and I think the ALA Code of Ethics is an important thing to include in there. It talks a lot about our responsibility as librarians. We don't have a bar association that guides how lawyers act, but we do have our Code of Ethics, which I think is an important and I think just as relevant as other professional code of ethics. Your material reconsideration policy should have these general topics. It needs to encourage the community members to explain their objections. Why do they not like this book? Why do they want to remove it? It should allow for an impartial staff member to read and view the materials. So that's hard if you're in a small library and there's 3 people. Do you include a member of the Board of Trustees? Do you have a community member who is willing to volunteer? I think those are important considerations to have. The staff should be directed to research the material. If they haven't read it, they should read it. They should review it. They should read the reviews. The staff on this committee can give a recommendation to the director, and I think it's up to the director of the library to decide and respond to the community member. But I also think it's important that we allow that community member to appeal to someone else if they don't like the decision. I think they need to know that they have a right to be heard, and I think it's important that these policies are followed. I think staff need to be trained on how to handle these situations on a regular basis. I think it should be done maybe even quarterly. It's like a fire drill. When it happens, everyone needs to know how to handle it. I think everyone from your shelver all the way up to the director should be very well versed, even if they know that when someone has a concern, you can go to this person or you can find this document there. I'm not saying it's the page's job to initiate this, but they should at least know how to handle in the beginning steps. And I think it's important also to remember that the Office of Intellectual Freedom should be contacted. They have very good resources and professional people that can help with these things. And I give this kind of as an overview, and I think if you're a librarian and have some experience, this might be a little pedantic, but I think it's important to stress that this is really a foundational principle, and these components are key. And they're key, I think, and I'll show that here in a little bit. As Hood County had these in place, they followed that, and that's why this process was able to go through how it is. I think it's important as librarians that we protect our collections from being removed. This is part of our interpretation of the Library Bill of Rights, that we can't remove it because we don't like it. We need to make sure that we are collecting for everybody who's in our community. Self-censorship, if we want to not buy a book because it deals with specifically GLBT topics, that's censorship as well. If you're afraid to buy something because you think it might be challenged, the Library Association said that that's a form of censorship. I think we have to buy things for everybody in our community. Other people have said, well, we don't need to buy anything because there's no one in our town who's GLBT. And I think that that's wrong. I think we don't know who is in our community. You may have someone. You may have a family. You may have a lot of families. But I think just because you don't know whether someone is GLBT doesn't mean you shouldn't buy those materials. I think it's important because you may not have them today, but tomorrow you might have a family that moves in that comes to the library, and they need to find stuff in the library that reflects their life and helps them to feel welcome and find the information they need. Removing things because they deal with GLBT topics is a form of censorship, and that's in the interpretation of the Library Bill of Rights. So that's kind of a high-level overview, I think, of collection development and reconsideration policies and some statements about that. And I want to talk briefly about Hood County. I know that Gayle has done that a little bit, so I'll run through this a little bit quickly. It involved 2 books, This Day in June and My Princess Boy. And as we said, a mother was shocked about it, to have this book. The librarian gave her a reconsideration form. Then there were other complaints made about My Princess Boy. I'm not sure if they looked in the catalog or whatnot. So the mother took the form to her church, and she asked other parishioners to fill out the form. About 50 people turned them in, and most of them on the box where it says, "Have you read this book?" had checked no. Most of them hadn't even read the book. They hadn't looked at it. And city council people began making statements and wanted to remove the book because they, of course, like we saw on this radio, I think that's a pretty typical response from a lot of the people. That they just thought it was wrong and in some cases disgusting. Slide there. One of the city council people said, can a 4-year-old understand this book without help of an adult? And she said no. And my response is, pick up most children's picture books. Kids can't understand lots of things. And that's because they're 4. They don't have the life experience to understand lots of things. And that's one of the reasons why parents should read to their children and should talk to them and have those discussions. And if we were to only write picture books that every 4-year-old could understand, I think that would be a disservice to them and to us. The Library Advisory Board reviewed the complaints and voted to keep the books in the collection. The director did move This Day in June to the nonfiction section because of its educational value. That was a decision that she made to kind of hopefully appease some of the people in the community. But the citizens were unhappy, and they appealed to the county commissioner's court. That's a Texas thing. It's your, I'm not sure, we call them commissioner's court. They're called judges, but they're not really judges. So the county board of trustees, and they held a public forum. And I went to that public forum, and I will tell you that it was a very scary thing. There was lots of emotion, lots of anger. It went on for quite a while. The board extended the time of the meeting to give everybody a chance to speak, and they did. And in the end, the county attorney said that previous case law suggested that removing, relocating, or any way restricting access to the book would likely constitute unlawful censorship. And so the book was retained. there were members, the commissioners all said that if they had their way, it would be removed, but they will defer to the law because their job is to uphold the law. But all 4 of them, in my recollection, all said that they thought the book should be removed, but their hands were tied because of the court case. And by the way, this legal precedent happened in Wichita Falls, Texas, a couple years ago, and it happens to be the same district that Hood County falls in. So it was a binding precedent, which in a strange turn of events is actually very interesting, and in fact good in this case that had happened. And the books were retained because the library had a written collection development policy and a materials reconsideration policy, and they followed them. They said, this is the plan of when this happens, and we're going to follow it. And because of that, they were able to retain the books. If they didn't have a consideration policy or they didn't have a collection development policy, it may have turned out differently, maybe not. But I think because they had those, it shows the importance of them. This is a picture.
So this.
Go ahead, Chris. I'm not sure what this is.
Yeah, this is a slide of from Facebook that talks about when Melanie was visiting different tea parties groups, and again, it points out. I know we're all gonna check our libraries for LGBT books now. So there is an agenda and there is a crusade, and people are really trying to advocate to pull these books off the shelves, and that's why it's so important that we learn how to safeguard these materials for our collections.
And I should also point out that the other book that they had complaints about, My Princess Boy, had been in the library for about 2 or 3 years, and no one had ever noticed it or complained about it, and it had checked out, I think, maybe once. So, you know, just because it's in there doesn't mean people are, first of all, reading it, because there are lots of books. Censorship also takes the form of disinvitations to speak and present. That's happened to a lot of authors. In Texas, there have been a number in the last couple of years, and I'll just scroll through some of these. In fact, most recently, down near Houston, there's been an incident, and in Vermont, as far as Vermont, this happens. And so I think that we have to remember that censorship is not just removing a book from the library, it's also from keeping people from talking about it. I'd also like to mention the GLBT Roundtable Tool Kit, open to all. It's available online as a PDF. It is designed for librarians of all types of libraries. Lots of times people say, I don't know how to serve the GLBT community. I'm not part of that. I have a presentation. I'm sorry, someone just opened the door. I have no idea how to help these community members, and so they can do this toolkit. So it's available online, and Kristen is being Vanna showing it, and it's available online as a PDF. We don't have printed copies. We printed some for our unveiling at PLA, but it's just a PDF for everyone to use and download as you see fit. And there are lots of resources in there. The other thing I want to talk about is GLBT Book Month, and one of the reasons we're having this webinar is because it is in June, and we want people to be able to celebrate the books that involve the GLBT community. They have lots of different types of books, adults, children, and we have some resources on this webpage. It's important that libraries have materials that reflect the values and the lives of the community they serve. And June is a way that we can showcase that and show the GLBT community that they are welcome to the library and that the resources are available for them. So I'd encourage you guys all to look at that. There are some free handouts, there are some book discussion guides, and we are encouraging people to celebrate this. It is an official ALA event, and it is something that we rolled out last year, and we'll be doing more things in the next coming years to kind of grow it. And with that, I think I will finish my section and pass it on to Susan. I ran through a lot of material very quickly, but I encourage you guys, if you have questions, to let me know.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So I would like to say hello, and I'm Suzan Cornermen. I am a mother of 2 children, and my youngest is a transgender boy. And I do believe that public libraries need to have diversity available in their collections that represent all ages, especially in the younger ages, as children who either are struggling to read or are on the verge of breaking through their ability to read and comprehend. Having books on poignant topics will enable them to better connect to characters and storylines, and that they can relate to or identify as being similar to themselves. Be it through specific topics such as race and culture and family dynamics, gender, sexuality, or various other interests. Whether the book selection is for entertainment or for information or somewhere in between, I've always believed that the knowledge gives one power and control over their own lives. In my own personal life, I have experienced this myself, and I have also seen it in my own children. Recently, I'm an early morning visitor to libraries, and I was walking in to go pick up some books on hold for my oldest child, and I hadn't intended on doing anything. It never occurred to me to go get a library name card changed, but I happened to look over to the information desk, and I saw a friendly GLBT person there working, and I walked over and inquired, how do I get a name and gender change on my child's library card? And so I went and asked, and she said, I'm not sure, and let me go check at the circulation. And she came back and she said, it's just as any other name change, whether it be through divorce or for marriage. So here's the form. And I could have taken care of it then, but I wanted my child to experience the empowerment that he could get from that. So I waited until after school a few days later, and we went in. And because I am an early morning person at the library, I did not recognize who we got at the circulation desk. And so we went and said we need a name change. And very calmly, this librarian was, oh, well, let me just see if there's any different procedure. And so she walked in the back and she goes, nope, it's just like anything else. And so she went step by step all the way through it, used the right personal pronouns, and he needs to sign here, and does he want to be able to check out video? And I'm thinking all this time, this is a huge thing to be done specifically in our city, because we're very, very conservative here and have had book banning happen in the past at this particular library. So, and part of the reason why it was good is it's the first affirmation that my child has the name that he identifies as, and that it is who it is, and he can go pick out books. And I mentioned the getting the books. He was never a reader, and I heard a author speak back in, it was probably in November on public radio, and the name of the book was None of the Above. And I quickly went and ordered it and thought, perfect, we're going to get this book, we're going to give it for a Christmas present. 3 days later, the book is done and read. I caught him reading at 11:30 at night. So for me, it's just huge. Sorry, I did not see the not sharing the picture. So at any rate, we ended up reading that book, or he ended up reading it in 3 days' time, into the wee hours of the night. And I went and tried to search online through our library other books in the GLBT genre, but I was really specifically trying to find books that had something my child could identify with, it being female to male. And I was having a very difficult time, and fast forward to the wee hours of the night, I private messaged Kristen and said, can you please give me a name or a title of something that is female to male? So many of these books on transgender is male to female that I can find. she gave me one name of a title, and I put that in, and it just kind of opened up the whole search for me. And since, I mean, my child's picking up 2 books at a time, and just recently, last week, got up really late in the morning for him, and he's a very early morning riser. It was after 9 o'clock in the morning, and he said, I went to bed at 4, and I still wasn't done with reading the book. So for me, that's just absolutely key, that these types of books and genre are available to kids that they can identify with. And with that, I don't have much more to say.
Thank you, Susan. I just think that your story is so important for librarians to hear. I want to quickly open it up to questions. Peter and Gayle, if you want to open on your webcams, if any of our participants have questions they want to ask, feel free to ask them in the chat box, or raise your hand if you have a mic, and we'll unmute you. This is a great time to get some advice on how to handle things in your library.
And by the way, let me just jump in and say that a couple of people have asked me to find the video of the commissioner's hearing in Hood County. I'm pulling up the website, but there's something, it's not allowing me to cut and paste the URL. So if you Google Hood County, Texas commissioner's hearings, you'll find the site. And the date that you want to look for is July 14th, 2015. And there's a link to that you'll see on that site.
And if you do watch that, I'll just ask you guys to ignore me because I flubbed the name of the roundtable. When I gave the speech, I was so nervous. So just ignore the fact that I don't know the name of the organization I represent and just move on with your life. I'm human.
It was a pretty pressure cooker hearing. So.
What was the date again, Gayle? It was
July 14th, 2015.
Okay.
I'll type it in.
Oh. Robert, let's see if I can. Do you have audio? Yes, okay. All right, go ahead. Make sure your microphone is unmuted.
Okay, I think you can hear me now.
Now we can, yes.
Yeah, we
Okay.
can. Good.
So, sorry about that. I had put up a note earlier in the chat box, and I just wanted to emphasize it in case people didn't get a chance to I mean, I find chats really hard to follow. But I talked about the need for libraries to have a communication procedure. Policy is good too, but a procedure, because I think it's important to identify your spokespersons. It's very important, as Peter said, to train all of your staff, and I would certainly encourage that. But I think you need to identify spokespeople in your library who are versed in dealing with media, with dealing with particular groups, because that's not just about knowing the issues, it's knowing how to talk to those people and managing communication. And in most of these situations, the best thing you can do is get out in front of the issue, not sit back and wait till the doggy-doo hits the fan, because you can control the story to some extent if you get out in front of it. I think it's very important. You know, everything that's been talked about here is really important, essential, in fact, because there are, and I made a second comment, it's not uncommon for groups of people to come in, ask for books to be taken off the shelf without ever having read them, because they are part of another group, and that group has an agenda, and they provide their members talking points. So these people come in and they sound like they know what they're talking about, but they're talking off a cheat sheet. They haven't read the book. They have no interest in reading the book. They might not even care, but their group has told them to go ahead and do something about this. So, protect yourself, and having a communication procedure and identifying, and then your spokespersons, and having them trained to deal particularly with media, I think is essential. In a previous lifetime, I used to do that, and it's really important to know how to deal with people from the media, because there's no such thing as off the record, even though you might think there is. And I'd be very careful, because everything you say will be held against you.
You make some very great points, Robert.
May I just say one more thing, because I went through internet porn hell 20 years ago when I was director of a library, and it was 6 months of, and the local newspaper had a member of the editorial staff who also had a column. So there was an article in the paper every single day, or an article in his column, or an editorial every single day, and I had to start meeting with my staff first thing in the morning and giving them a pep talk and holding them up and standing there. And what I learned is that we had a really sympathetic journalist come. Very nice guy. His mother was a librarian, and he was really sympathetic to the issue. And then the article got written that it was nothing like what he wrote. And he actually called me to apologize and said, "I'm sorry. You know that this isn't what I wanted. My editor changed the article." So that's why I'm saying there's no such thing as off the record. Everything you say can and will be used against you, so please be careful what you say.
Especially on social media.
Yeah, well, yes.
Do we have any other questions or comments? It is 12:02, and I hate to wrap things up, but I want to make sure that if anybody has a question for Peter or Gayle or Susan, I'm going to switch to the next slide, but please feel free to continue typing if you need to. I just want to share our e-learning page. Which isn't actually on this slide. But you can always follow us on social media. We have an Intellectual Freedom News. Anybody can subscribe to it, and that always has our e-learning that's coming up. And a special thanks to Gayle and Peter and Susan for their time and experiences. We so appreciate it. Okay, Rebecca, do you know of any continuing ed classes or online classes on YA Lit that focuses on GLBT literature? I don't right off the top of my head. Peter, do you know of anything?
I'm not sure of anything that ALA offers specifically on that. I know I have a former member of the Stonewall Book Awards committee who teaches a class in his university in his professional role that does that, but I don't know if it's not online and it's not a continuing ed class. Rebecca, I'd be curious to see what you're looking for exactly. You're looking for a class that talks about current trends or just kind of a reader's advisory class? But that's an interesting topic. I do know that ALSC does occasionally offer, that's the Association of Library Services of Children, they do offer some continuing ed or some online learning classes on like the Newberry and the Caldecott. But that might be an interesting avenue to pursue with them, okay, current trends and issues. Yeah, that's something that we're looking to do some more webinars with the GLBT Roundtable, and we'll definitely put that on our list of something that might be interesting to do. So I don't unfortunately have anything right now, but I'll put it on our list of things to maybe plan, and in the next couple of months we might have something that we can
This is a link to the online learning page, and you can search by topic or by unit. A lot of time ALSC will have things, and YALSA as well, because there's so many fantastic young adult books written with GLBT characters. So I think there'd be some really great stuff there.
Also,
and I
if
think
you
too, also
are on Twitter, actually even if you're not on Twitter, but you may want to consider following We Need Diverse Books. They also have a website, and they have reading lists for obviously a variety of diverse categories, including but not limited to GLBT literature, and they have quite a few good YA selections. And if you follow them on Twitter, they oftentimes post different Twitter chats or webinars or classes, what have you, having to do with all sorts of different groups, but they also tend to post a lot about LGBT, so you may want to check them out too.
And I think also if you're looking for current popular things to kind of see what people are reading, I think checking out the Rainbow Book List and also the Lambda Literary Awards do categories for children and adult. And I think both of those are also have lots of good current books that would be a good good thing if you're just looking for something to read to find out what's popular and out there.
Any other questions or thoughts?
I think that GLBT versus LGBT, I think it's a matter of preference. We use GLBT and ALA because the Roundtable was originally the gay task force, and then we just added letters onto it after that. But here in the city of Dallas, we use LGBT. I think it's just a matter of preference.
I just try to be consistent with.
Or you could just be you could just be BLT like the people on the radio and just call it good, right? So. Sorry, that's probably inappropriate.
Well, again, I want to say thank you to everyone who joined us today. It's really important to keep talking about these issues that are coming up, talking about them with your staff, ways that we can serve all of the patrons, way that we can be a safe space for our community, and to continue to raise awareness about censorship and having diverse books in our library. So thank you everyone for coming, and thank you to Peter and Gayle and Susan. I really, really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Oh, thank you. This is great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.